Hi, this is Professor Geeta Shah teaching you Chapter 11 today. Chapter 11 is on an introduction to open economy, macroeconomics, learning objectives. After finishing this chapter, you will be able to draw diagram on shift in aggregate demand or supply and explain the impact on the price level and GDP. You will be able to draw diagram and show the effects on GDP and the price level of expansionary and contractionary fiscal and monetary policies. You will be able to analyze the effects of fiscal and monetary policies on the current account and the exchange rate. You will be able to explain how expenditure switching and expenditure reducing policies can be used to reduce a current account deficit. You will be able to draw a J curve and use it to show how exchange rate depreciation does not lead to an immediate reduction in current account deficit. Introduction: the macroeconomy in a global setting. Since the Great Depression of the 1930s, national governments have held a central role in guaranteeing economic growth, employment, and price stability. However, besides policies, the day-to-day operations of governments, consumers, and businesses alike have a major impact on the current account and exchange rates. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Intermediate inputs: goods purchased by one business from another for use in production. For example, a car manufacturer purchases glass, tires, steel, and so on. The payment for auto glass is not directly income to households because it is paid to another business, but if traced back, it ultimately becomes income. Table 11.1: the main economic agents in the macroeconomy. There are four agents in the macroeconomy: households, businesses, government, foreigners. Households supply factors like land, labor, capital to business. Purchase consumer goods and services. They save, they pay taxes. Businesses, they use the factors supplied by households to produce the nation's output. They purchase investment goods. Government purchase government goods and services. They collect taxes. Foreigners, they purchase exports, we call EX. Foreigners, they supply imports, we call IM. There are four main agents in the macroeconomy. Each one is a different source of demand for goods and services. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The aggregate supply curve calls attention of three regions of GDP: under, nearing, and at or beyond full employment equilibrium. The aggregate demand curve shows expenditure by consumers, business, the government, and foreign purchases of exports minus domestic purchases of imports at various price levels. Figure 11.1: aggregate demand, aggregate supply. In this diagram, we can see aggregate demand curve has negative slope and aggregate supply curve is parallel to horizontal line in the beginning that shows that still there are inputs available to produce more. After that, it becomes upward sloping that shows that inputs are becoming scarce, and beyond some point it becomes vertical that shows we used all the inputs at full capacity. The aggregate demand AD curve shows the level of output, GDP, and price, P, where expenditure, decisions, and price match. Aggregate supply, AS, shows the level of output and price where output and prices match. Together, they show the level of equilibrium output Q1 and prices P1, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. On the horizontal part of the aggregate supply, the economy is operating below full employment. The middle upward sloping part of the AS curve symbolizes the range of GDP where inputs begin to become scarce. The vertical region of AS curve, the economy is at full employment and no more output is possible until new workers enter the labor force or new factories and machines are built. Changes in aggregate supply or demand which can occur, the numerous reasons lead to new levels of GDP and prices. An increase in the consumption expenditure C, business investment I, or government spending G, for example, would increase aggregate demand. When GDP or price levels are not at their desired level, macroeconomic, monetary, or fiscal policy may be prescribed. Figure 11.2, a shift in aggregate demand curve. An increase in aggregate demand will cause an increase in GDP and rise in the price level. Here you can see that aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and GDP increases from Q1 to Q2 and price level increases from P1 to P2. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply continued. Statistical analysis, a quantitative relationship between income received by households and household consumption. As income rises, so do expenditures. Multiplier effect. An increase in demand ultimately results in an even larger increase in production and income as effects of the demand hike run through economy. Fiscal and monetary policies. Fiscal policy covers government taxation and expenditures, usually formulated by the legislative and executive branches. Monetary policy covers money supply and interest rates, usually formulated by the central bank and the finance ministry. Fiscal and monetary policies continued. Institutions that enact fiscal and monetary policy vary across countries. Legislative and executive branches are responsible for tax policy and for determining spending priorities. Central bank and the finance ministry set monetary policy, sometimes with direct input from the executive branch of the government. Fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy increases in government spending and or cuts in the taxes. These result in an increase in output. These have a positive multiplier effect. Contractionary fiscal policy cuts in government spending and or increases in taxes. These have a negative multiplier effect. Monetary policy. Monetary policy works through a combination of change to the supply of money and change to interest rates, open market operations, most frequently used technique by the central government. The central banks buying and selling of bonds in the open market. Selling bonds leads the nation's financial institutions to give up some of their cash, with cash reserves shrinking throughout the economy. Figure 11.3, money supply and demand. You can see here, as the central bank increases the money supply shifts to the right. Here money supply is vertical because money supply is fixed by the central bank. And demand for money has negative slope. An increase in supply of money reduces the interest rate. Monetary policy. The central bank's increasing the supply of money in the economy reduces the interest rate. Expansionary monetary policy, an increase in the money supply and decrease in the interest rates. Contractionary monetary policy, a decrease in the money supply and a rise in interest rates. Figure 11.4 shows real GDP growth in United States from 1930 to 1941. Current account balances revisited. Recall, S plus T minus G is equal to I plus CA. How does a change in income caused by a change in monetary or fiscal policy affect the current account? Figure 11.5, an increase in the demand for money. This diagram shows that demand for money increases and demand curve shifts to the right. Supply of money is vertical, so increase in demand for money increases the interest rate. An increase in income causes households to increase their money holdings. As a consequence, interest rate rise. Fiscal and monetary policy and the current account. Once the exchange rate effects of monetary and fiscal policy have been identified, it is relatively easy to describe their effects on the current account. Effect of fiscal policy on the current account is definite, while the effect of monetary policy is ambiguous. Fiscal and monetary policy, the current account. Expansionary monetary policy. Increase in the money supply reduces interest rate, causing a depreciation in the domestic currency. Exchange rate depreciation switches some consumer spending from foreign goods imports to domestic goods. Foreign goods become relatively expensive. A more robust expansion of the domestic economy results. Expansionary monetary policy is reinforced by the changes in the exchange rate. Fiscal and monetary policy and the current account. Contractionary monetary policy has the opposite effect. Interest rates rise, causing an appreciation of the domestic currency, which makes imports relatively cheaper. The reduction in demand for domestic goods reinforces the impact of contractionary monetary policy on income, consumption, and investment, leads to more vigorous decline in economic activity than would occur in a closed economy. Table 11.2. The main effects of fiscal and monetary policies. Monetary and fiscal policies have different impacts on interest rates, exchange rates, and the current account. Monetary policies' impact on the exchange rates and income partially offset each other's impact on the current account. Here, fall in R is an appreciation of currency, while a rise in R is depreciation of currency. Macro policies for the current account imbalances. expenditure switching policies and expenditure reducing policies, a combination of fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies for addressing current account imbalances. Expenditure switching policies include exchange rate depreciation and trade barriers. Expenditure reducing policies are contractionary monetary or fiscal policies. Macro policies for current account imbalances. These two policies must be applied simultaneously. Expenditure shifts without expenditure reduction are inflationary. Expenditure reductions without shift towards domestic producers is recessionary. The adjustment process. Adjustment process describes changes in the trade deficit that are caused by a change in exchange rate. For example, depreciation raises the real price of foreign goods, making domestic substitutes more attractive. Depreciation has, however, a time lag. Moreover, the first impact of depreciation may be a J curve, a deterioration of the current account. Figure 11.6, the J curve. You can see that initially depreciation often causes the current account balance to deteriorate. Further, with time, substitutions of domestic goods for foreign goods lead an improvement in the balances. You can see here, lead the improvement in the balances. Figure 11.7, the US trade balance and the exchange rate from 1980 to 1988. In the 1980s, changes in US trade balance mirrored change in exchange rate with a lag of 2 years. Macroeconomic policy coordination in developed countries. Leading industrial economies discuss macroeconomic issues, international relations, and relations with developing countries at the G8 summit. If global imbalances arise, they discuss the potential for policy coordination. Macroeconomic policy coordination in developed countries continued. Policy coordination among all countries of the world is difficult. Nations want to guard sovereignty. Nations are reluctant to pursue same policies as trading partners.